I'm Jessica, 32 years old, and I own a small bakery in a town where old money speaks louder than fresh bread. When I married Ryan, I knew his wealthy family might be a challenge. But I never expected his mother Margaret would actually ban me from a family dinner. The restaurant incident that followed changed everything between us. The look on her face when she realized who really owned the place? Priceless. Before I tell you how my mother-in-law's face turned ghostly white when she realized who the restaurant owner really was, let me know where you're watching from and hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, karma has never tasted so delicious. I grew up watching my mom stretch every dollar until Washington's face practically cried for mercy. We weren't poor exactly, but culinary school wasn't something my parents could just write a check for. I worked 3 jobs, took out loans, and still remember the smell of coffee clinging to my uniform as I'd rush from my barista shift to evening classes. Those years taught me more than just how to make the perfect croissant. They taught me persistence. That persistence built my little bakery, Sweet Foundations. It wasn't much at first, just me, a rented kitchen, and recipes I'd perfected during sleepless nights. But my pastries gained a following. Local coffee shops started ordering my goods, then small restaurants, and finally I saved enough to open my own storefront. The day I hung that sign with my name on it was the proudest moment of my life. I met Ryan at a charity auction where I was catering desserts. He wasn't like the other guests in their tailored suits who barely acknowledged service staff. He came into the kitchen specifically to compliment my lemon tarts and asked for my card. For the bakery, he insisted with a smile that made my heart skip. When he called the next day, I assumed it was for a catering order. Instead, he asked me to dinner. Our connection was immediate and genuine. Ryan worked in architectural restoration. He preserved historical buildings while I preserved family recipes. We both appreciated craftsmanship and tradition, just in different forms. He loved that I had built something from nothing. I loved that despite his privileged background, he valued hard work and authenticity. "You know my family's a bit intense," he warned me after a few months of dating, especially my mother. I remember laughing it off. Everyone thinks their mom is intense. I'm sure she's lovely. The first time I met Walter, Ryan's father, was at their country club. He was reserved but polite, asking thoughtful questions about my business and actually listening to the answers. I felt hopeful after that meeting. Maybe this wouldn't be so difficult after all. Then I met Margaret. She arrived late to our lunch, air-kissed Ryan, and gave me a once-over that somehow made my carefully chosen dress feel like a dish rag. "So you're the baker," she said, making it sound like I made mud pies for a living. Despite that rough start, I was determined to win her over. I brought my special pastries to their home, offered to help plan family functions, asked about her charity work. She'd accept my offerings with a tight smile, then subtly rearrange whatever I'd touched, or mention how her friend's daughter, from the Williams family, had just gotten engaged to a surgeon. The comments were always just indirect, enough that confronting her would make me look sensitive. "Oh, you made these yourself? How rustic." Or, "That dress is quite youthful for someone your age." Or, my personal favorite, "Ryan always did have a soft spot for charity cases. Our wedding was beautiful but tense." Margaret insisted on handling most of the planning, which meant I had to fight for every personal touch. She accidentally left my parents off certain event invitations. She changed the bakery I'd chosen for our cake to one her friends approved of. Ryan tried to mediate, but he'd been navigating his mother's manipulations his entire life and often couldn't even see them happening. When we bought our home, modest by his family's standards but a dream come true for me, I felt such relief. Our own space, our own rules. A place where I didn't have to worry about using the wrong fork or saying the wrong thing. But family. Dinners at the in-laws' estate continued, and with them, Margaret's campaign to make me feel inadequate. I'd arrive with homemade bread, and she'd mention her gluten sensitivity. which mysteriously disappeared when dessert arrived. I'd mention a new client for my bakery, and she'd change the subject to her friend's daughter, who had just been featured in some society magazine. "You're imagining things," Ryan said when I first brought it up. "Mom is just set in her ways. She'll warm up eventually." But as months passed, even Ryan couldn't deny the pattern, especially after the Christmas fiasco where Margaret presented everyone with thoughtfully personalized gifts, a vintage watch for Ryan, a first edition book for Walter, and handed me a generic department store gift card with the price still attached. I tried addressing it directly once. "Margaret, I feel like we got off on the wrong foot. Is there something I've done that bothers you?" She looked genuinely confused. "Why, Jessica? What a strange question. I've been nothing but welcoming. Perhaps you're just not used to our family dynamics." And just like that, she managed to make me feel like I was the problem. So I started keeping a journal. Each slight, each backhanded compliment, each time she forgot something important to me. All documented so I could remind myself I wasn't crazy. Sometimes I'd read entries to Ryan, who began to see the pattern too. "She treated my college girlfriend the same way," he admitted one night. "And my sister's husband at first. I guess I just thought it was normal because it's all I've known." That's when I realized Margaret didn't hate me specifically. She was threatened by anyone she hadn't chosen herself, anyone who might disrupt her control over the family. Understanding that didn't make it hurt less, but it helped me stop taking it personally. I found unexpected allies in Ryan's sister Emma and his cousin Michael. Over wine one night, Emma confessed. She did the same to James when we first married. Called him the accountant for 2 years instead of his name. Now she loves him because he's useful for her tax questions. Michael laughed. "Remember when—" She told the Hendersons I was taking a break from real work when I started my online business. Now she brags about my company valuation. Their stories gave me hope that Margaret could eventually accept me, but they also confirmed I wasn't imagining things. The validation was worth its weight in gold. So I developed strategies. I'd prepare neutral topics before family gatherings. I'd bring Ryan as a buffer for one-on-one interactions. I started responding to passive-aggressive comments with direct questions. "What exactly do you mean by that, Margaret?" It didn't stop. Her behavior. But it made me feel less powerless. Still, I never imagined she would escalate things so dramatically. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The more I stood my ground, the more desperate she became to put me in my place. As months passed, Margaret's behavior grew more troubling. Sunday dinners at their sprawling colonial home became weekly exercises in emotional endurance. I'd sit through 3 courses of subtle digs, watching the grandfather clock in the corner, and counting minutes until we could politely leave. There was the time she served shellfish after I had mentioned my mild allergy, forcing me to pick around my plate while she feigned concern. "Oh dear, I completely forgot. There's some bread in the kitchen, I think." Or the countless times she'd interrupt me mid-sentence to ask Ryan an unrelated question, as if my voice was merely background noise. She developed an uncanny ability to redirect any positive attention that came my way, especially from Walter, who had started showing genuine interest in my bakery's growth. "Jessica was telling me about her new commercial oven," Walter would say. "Speaking of new things," Margaret would interject, "have you seen the renovations at the Thompson estate? They've imported Italian marble that would look perfect in your next project, Ryan." Her wardrobe critiques became more pointed too. "That blouse is certainly brave," she said once, eyebrows raised. "I suppose in your line of work, practical trumps fashionable." This coming from a woman whose idea of casual wear was pearls with cashmere. Then came the parade of suitable women mysteriously invited to family functions. Daughters of Margaret's friends would appear at dinners, charity events, even at casual gatherings. They were invariably from good families, with prestigious degrees and connections to mention casually in conversation. Amanda's father sits on the board with Walter, Margaret would announce, placing this Amanda conspicuously next to Ryan. And she just finished her second master's degree at Princeton. Ryan would squeeze my hand under the table, a silent apology and reassurance. Later, he'd assure me he had no interest in these women, but the message was clear. Margaret was still shopping for a replacement. The most hurtful discovery came through Emma, who overheard Margaret at her tennis club. "Ryan's going through a phase with this Baker girl," she'd told her friends over mimosas. "It's just a temporary situation until he comes to his senses. She's not exactly Bridgerton material, is she?" When Emma reluctantly shared this with me, something broke inside. I'd been trying so hard to be accepted, to prove my worth, and Margaret had been dismissing me as temporary all along. "You need to say something," I told Ryan that night, tears streaming down my face. "She doesn't have to like me, but she needs to respect our marriage." Ryan sighed, running his hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize. "You don't understand how she works. Confronting her directly will just make things worse." "Worse than telling her friends I'm a temporary phase? Worse than parading eligible women in front of you at every opportunity?" "She doesn't mean it, the way it sounds," he said weakly. "It's just her generation, her social circle. They talk that way." His defense of her behavior hurt almost as much as the behavior itself. "So you're okay with her treating me like this forever? Because that's what you're choosing if you stay silent." That argument led to our first serious talk about boundaries, with his family. Ryan finally agreed to speak with his mother, though he insisted on handling it his way. Whatever he said made little difference. Margaret simply became more careful, more calculated. The insults grew more subtle, the exclusion more systematic. She'd plan family events when she knew I had bakery commitments. She'd forget to pass on important family news until the last minute. I started documenting everything in my journal, no longer just for my sanity, but as concrete evidence for Ryan. April 15th. Margaret asked about children again, suggested my biological clock must be deafening by now, and mentioned Ryan's family history of fertility well into their 40s. Or, May 23rd, family photo session arranged during my bakery's biggest catering event of the year. When I couldn't attend, prints were ordered for everyone except me. The journal became thick with these entries. Some days I wondered if I was overreacting, if perhaps I was the problem. But then Ryan's cousin Michael confided that Margaret had treated his wife Sarah the same way for years. "It only stopped when our second child was born," he explained during a rare moment alone at a family gathering. Suddenly, Sarah was the mother of her precious grandbabies, so Margaret did a complete 180. Now they're best friends, as long as Sarah never contradicts her about anything related to the kids. So my options are endure indefinitely, or get pregnant to earn acceptance? I laughed bitterly. Great choices. There's a third option, Michael said quietly. Stand your ground so firmly she has no choice but to respect you. Sarah wishes she'd done that instead of seeking approval for 7 years. His words stayed with me, especially as Margaret's controlling nature extended beyond just our interactions. She began making comments about our home. Such a starter place. Our vacation choices. Wouldn't you rather join us in Tuscany instead of that road trip? And even my business decisions. A second location seems ambitious for someone with your background. Ryan was gradually seeing the pattern more clearly, especially after she crossed a line during his birthday dinner. I'd spent days preparing his favorite foods, including a multi-layered cake that showcased every technique I'd mastered over the years. Margaret took one bite, placed her fork down, and said, "It's a bit dry, dear, but that's to be expected when you're self-taught rather than properly trained." The table fell silent. Even Walter looked uncomfortable. "Actually," Ryan said, his voice tight, "Jessica graduated top of her class from culinary school and apprenticed under Chef Lewis at the Grand before starting her own business. Her training is more extensive than most of the chefs at the restaurants you frequent, Mom. It was the first time he'd publicly corrected her, and Margaret's face showed genuine shock before quickly composing herself. Well, I suppose everyone has different taste preferences, she recovered, but the damage was done. That night, Ryan apologized for not standing up for me sooner. I'm starting to see what you've been dealing with all this time, he admitted. It's like I was programmed to overlook her behavior. It felt like a breakthrough, but Margaret was nothing if not adaptable. She simply shifted tactics again, becoming overly sweet in Ryan's presence while maintaining her true colors when we were alone. Meanwhile, I found unexpected support in Emma and her husband James, who had survived their own trial by Margaret and emerged with boundaries intact. We began meeting for dinner away from family gatherings, creating a space where we could speak freely. The only language Margaret understands is power, Emma explained over wine. She respects people who stand up to her, though she'd never admit it. The longer you try to appease her, the less she'll respect you. But every time I assert myself, she turns it around to make me look difficult. That's her specialty. James nodded. She baits you into reacting, then plays victim. The trick is to stand your ground without giving her ammunition. Their advice was helpful, but putting it into practice proved challenging. Every interaction with Margaret felt like navigating a minefield. Still, I was developing thicker skin and learning to pick my battles. Then came the invitation that would change everything. Walter's 60th birthday was approaching, and Margaret took charge of planning the celebration with her usual efficiency. For weeks, all family conversations revolved around this milestone event. We've reserved the private dining room at La Maison Dorée, Margaret announced during Sunday dinner, her voice dripping with significance. It's the most exclusive restaurant in the city. They only take reservations 3 months in advance, and you practically need references just to get on the waiting list. My interest was immediately piqued. La Maison Dorée had opened about a year ago to rave reviews. Its executive chef and owner had created a menu that fused classical French techniques with innovative flavor combinations. As someone in the food industry, I'd been dying to experience it firsthand. That sounds wonderful, I said, genuinely excited. Walter deserves a special celebration. Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, it will be quite the sophisticated evening. The chef trained in Paris and worked at 3 Michelin-starred restaurants before opening his own establishment. The implied comparison to my more modest culinary background wasn't lost on me, but I refused to take the bait. I've heard amazing things about their seasonal tasting menu. What a perfect choice for Walter's birthday. Over the next 2 weeks, the dinner became the focal point of family discussions. Margaret dropped constant references to the restaurant's exclusivity, the celebrities who dined there, the extensive wine list curated by a master sommelier. I decided this was an opportunity to try a different approach with Margaret. Instead of retreating from her subtle digs, I'd engage enthusiastically and give her no reason to exclude me. I researched the restaurant extensively, learning about the chef's background and specialties. I even bought a new dress for the occasion. Nothing flashy, but elegant enough for an upscale restaurant. I can't wait for Friday, I told Ryan, as we drove home from yet another planning session at his parents' house. Despite your mother's best efforts, I'm actually looking forward to this dinner. The food is supposed to be incredible. Mom's in rare form lately, Ryan agreed, looking tired. But Dad seems genuinely excited about this birthday celebration, so let's focus on making it special for him. 3 days before the dinner, my phone rang with Margaret's number on the screen. Unusual, since she typically communicated with me through Ryan or via group texts that included the entire family. Puzzled, I answered. Jessica, dear. Her voice came through with practiced sweetness. I'm calling about Friday's dinner. Yes? Is there a change of plans? I asked, already sensing something was off. Well, it's a bit awkward, but there's been a slight miscommunication with the reservation. Apparently, La Maison Dorée has very strict seating limitations for their private dining room. My stomach tightened. Okay. So unfortunately, we'll need to adjust our party size. Since this is primarily a celebration for Walter with his closest colleagues and oldest friends, we thought it would make the most sense if you sat this one out. I'm sure you understand. These types of establishments have very rigid policies. The calculated precision of her exclusion left me momentarily speechless. She'd waited until 3 days before the event, after weeks of discussion, to suddenly claim there wasn't room for me. Let me get this straight, I finally managed, keeping my voice steady. You're uninviting me from my father-in-law's birthday dinner? Does Ryan know about this? Oh, I haven't had a chance to discuss it with him yet, she replied smoothly. But I'm sure he'll understand the constraints we're dealing with. It's not personal, Jessica. It's simply a matter of priorities and limited space. How many people will be there? I asked. Her hesitation was brief but noticeable. 14. And they can't accommodate 15? It's complicated, she said, vaguely. These fine dining establishments have very specific arrangements. After ending the call, I immediately checked the restaurant's website. Their private dining room accommodated up to 20 guests comfortably. I then called the restaurant directly, posing as a potential customer with general questions. The hostess confirmed they could easily adjust for additional guests with advance notice. When Ryan came home that evening, I was still seething. Your mother called today to uninvite me from Walter's birthday dinner. His expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally anger as I recounted the conversation. That's ridiculous. I'm calling her right now. Ryan's conversation with Margaret quickly escalated. She maintained that the restaurant had strict limitations, that it was nothing personal, and that surely I would understand since these upscale establishments operate differently than the casual places Jessica might be familiar with. When Ryan challenged her about the restaurant's actual capacity, she changed tactics. Fine. If you must know the truth, several of Walter's colleagues are bringing their wives, and I'm concerned that Jessica might feel out of place. The conversation will revolve around topics she's unfamiliar with. I'm trying to spare her discomfort. The speakerphone carried her words clearly across our kitchen. Each one landed like a small, precise cut. That's not your decision to make, Ryan said firmly. Jessica is my wife and Walter's daughter-in-law. She belongs at this family celebration. Ryan, darling, be reasonable. Jessica wouldn't fit in with this crowd. This isn't like your casual dinner parties with takeout containers and paper napkins. People will be discussing art acquisitions and European travel. What would Jessica contribute to such conversations? I watched Ryan's face redden as his mother continued to speak as if I wasn't sitting right there listening to every word. The argument went in circles, with Margaret alternating between logistical excuses and thinly veiled insults about my social standing. If Jessica isn't welcome, then I won't be attending either, Ryan finally declared. That's when Margaret employed her most effective weapon. Guilt. On your father's 60th birthday? The day he's being honored by colleagues who have flown in specifically for this occasion? He would be devastated by your absence. Is that really how you want to handle this? The manipulation was masterful. Ryan looked torn, caught between defending me and disappointing his father. After he hung up, we had our own heated discussion. You should go, I said eventually, though it hurt to say the words. Your dad deserves to have you there on his birthday. And just let my mother win? Let her exclude you without consequences? We'll deal with her afterward. This isn't about her. It's about Walter. I don't know, Ryan sighed. Conflict etched across his face. Showing up without you feels like I'm validating her behavior. Then make it clear this is a one-time exception because of your father, not a precedent, I insisted. And we'll set firm boundaries afterward. That night, after Ryan had fallen into troubled sleep, I scrolled mindlessly through social media, too angry to rest. A targeted ad for La Maison Dorée appeared in my feed, showcasing their latest seasonal menu. I clicked through to their page out of masochistic curiosity and froze when I saw the executive chef's photo, Antonio Reyes, my mentor from culinary school. I enlarged the image, hardly believing my eyes. Antonio had been an instructor during my final year, a talented chef who had taken special interest in my work. He'd recognized something in me that others hadn't, a creativity beyond technical skill. When I doubted myself, he pushed me to experiment, to develop my own style rather than just mastering classical techniques. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years. I knew he'd gone, on to work at prestigious restaurants, but I'd lost track of his career after opening my own bakery. Apparently, he'd risen through the ranks to become an acclaimed chef in his own right, eventually opening La Maison Dorée to critical acclaim. Memories flooded back, Antonio testing my blind palate identification, challenging me to create desserts with unconventional ingredient pairings, writing a glowing recommendation that helped me land my first professional kitchen position. He'd been one of the few people who truly believed in my potential when I was still figuring it out myself. I hesitated only briefly before finding his contact information. This wasn't about asking for special treatment. I just needed to reconnect with someone who had always valued me for my abilities rather than my background. The next morning, I called the restaurant and left a message for Antonio. To my surprise, he called back within the hour, his familiar voice warm with genuine pleasure. "Jessica Baker, it's been too long. How's that bakery of yours doing?" We caught up briefly on our professional journeys before I reluctantly explained the upcoming dinner situation. I was careful to frame it factually, without casting Margaret as a villain or myself as a victim. "I'm not asking you to intervene," I finished awkwardly. "I just thought I should let you know I'm connected to the Walter Hampton party on Friday, even though I apparently won't be joining them." Antonio's silence lasted several seconds before he responded. "That's interesting. And you say this is your father-in-law's birthday celebration?" "Yes, his wife organized it as a surprise." "I see." Something in his tone shifted. "Well, regardless of Friday's event, we should reconnect properly. Your work was always exceptional. I've followed your bakery's growth from afar." We ended the call with promises to meet professionally soon. I hadn't asked for any intervention, and Antonio hadn't offered any. But as I hung up, a small rebellious idea began forming in my mind. That evening, I shared my discovery with my best friend Amanda over wine at her apartment. "Antonio Reyes owns La Maison Dorée, the Antonio who basically launched your career?" She leaned forward, eyes wide. "Jessica, this is perfect. You have to show up." "And do what exactly?" "Create a scene at Walter's birthday?" "Not a scene, a statement." Amanda topped off my wine glass. "Your mother-in-law didn't just cross a line, she demolished it. She's counting on your good manners to keep you away. What if, for once, you didn't comply with her expectations?" The more we talked, the more my resolve strengthened. Margaret had calculated that I would either cause a family rift by keeping Ryan from attending, or I would quietly accept my exclusion. Either way, she won. But there was a third option she hadn't considered. Friday evening arrived with a knot of anxiety in my stomach. Ryan had reluctantly gone ahead to the restaurant, after extracting my promise that I wouldn't spend the evening dwelling on Margaret's latest power play. He planned to have a serious conversation with both his parents after the birthday celebration. I stood in front of our bedroom mirror, smoothing the silk of my carefully chosen dress. It was a deep burgundy that complemented my skin tone, elegant without being flashy. I'd styled my hair in a simple updo and applied makeup that enhanced without overwhelming. Sophisticated, but not trying too hard. "You can do this," I told my reflection, though my hands trembled slightly as I fastened my grandmother's pearl earrings. These pearls had seen my graduation, my wedding, the opening of my bakery. They carried the strength of the women in my family who had overcome their own obstacles. The drive to La Maison Dorée felt simultaneously too long and too short. My mind raced through potential scenarios, rehearsing what I might say, how I would remain composed regardless of Margaret's reaction. The valet took my keys with a courteous nod, unaware of the drama I was about to walk into. Through the restaurant's front windows, I could see the private dining room where Walter's celebration was already underway. Crystal glasses caught the light from elegant chandeliers. Well-dressed guests mingled with practiced ease. I spotted Ryan sitting beside his father, smiling at something Walter was saying, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. And there was Margaret, resplendent in midnight blue, holding court at the center of the table like a queen surveying her domain. For a moment, my courage wavered. What if this backfired spectacularly? What if I was making a terrible mistake that would only reinforce Margaret's narrative about me? No, I whispered to myself. I have every right to be here. I am not the problem. I squared my shoulders and entered the restaurant. The maitre d' approached with a professional smile. Good evening, madam. Do you have a reservation? I'm actually here for the Hampton birthday celebration, I replied, keeping my voice steady. His expression shifted to slight confusion as he consulted his tablet. I don't see your name on the final guest list. There must be some mistake. There is indeed a mistake, came a familiar voice from behind him. But not on your part, Claude. Antonio emerged from the kitchen doors, still wearing his chef's jacket, his familiar smile widening as he approached. Jessica Baker, it's been too long. He embraced me warmly before turning to the puzzled maitre d'. Jessica was one of my most brilliant students. Please add a place at the Hampton table immediately, in the place of honor. The maitre d' nodded quickly and moved to comply as Antonio turned back to me. I was wondering if you might show up tonight. After our call, I did some checking on this reservation. Quite interesting to discover it was modified several times, including a specific instruction that no additional guests were to be accommodated, regardless of request. My eyebrows raised. That does sound like Margaret. Well, fortunately, for you, I have a strict policy. In my restaurant, I decide who sits at which table. He offered his arm. Shall we surprise your in-laws? As we approached the private dining room, I could see Ryan's back to the entrance. Walter was mid-story, gesturing animatedly while the table laughed appreciatively. Margaret sat at his side, surveying her perfectly orchestrated event with satisfied pride. Then she saw me. The color drained from her face so rapidly I momentarily worried she might faint. Her champagne glass froze halfway to her lips, her eyes widening in disbelief. Antonio led me straight to the table with the confidence of someone who owned not just the restaurant, but the very ground beneath it. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your celebration. The conversation halted as all eyes turned toward us. Walter looked pleasantly confused. Ryan spun around, shock transforming into delighted relief as he saw me. I believe you have a guest who was inadvertently left off the list, Antonio continued smoothly. Jessica and I go back many years. She was one of my most promising culinary students before she established her own successful bakery. Margaret found her voice, though it emerged higher than usual. There must be some misunderstanding. We have a strict number of guests confirmed for tonight. I met her gaze directly, a smile firmly in place. How strange. When I called the restaurant earlier this week, they assured me they could easily accommodate additional guests in this room. Antonio's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only indication that he understood the full situation. Indeed, this room comfortably seats 20, and I count only 14 of you here tonight. Walter looked between his wife and me, confusion giving way to suspicion. Margaret, what's going on? Before she could respond, Ryan stood and came to my side, placing his arm around my waist. Dad, apparently there was some confusion about the guest list. Mom told Jessica earlier this week that there wasn't room for her tonight. What? Walter's jovial expression hardened as he turned to Margaret. Is that true? Margaret's composure slipped momentarily before she recovered. forcing a tight laugh. Oh, there's been a terrible miscommunication. I simply meant the original. Table was at capacity, but of course we'd make accommodations. Jessica must have misunderstood. The blatant lie hung in the air. I could have challenged it, could have reminded her of her exact words about me not fitting in with this crowd. But something in Walter's expression told me it wasn't necessary. He knew. Instead, I burst into laughter. Genuine, liberating laughter at the sheer absurdity of the situation. What incredible timing that the owner of La Maison Dorée happens to be my former mentor. The culinary world is surprisingly small, isn't it? Antonio smiled broadly. Claude, please bring another chair for Mrs. Hampton. She'll sit beside her husband and across from her father-in-law, the guest of honor. As the staff rearranged the seating, Antonio turned to the table. It's a special pleasure to serve the family of one of my most talented former students. Jessica's understanding of flavor balance was exceptional even as a student. I still use her chocolate lavender tart as an example for my new chefs. Margaret looked as though she'd swallowed something unpleasant. Ryan squeezed my hand under the table as I took my seat, his eyes communicating both apology and admiration. Walter leaned forward, suddenly interested. You never mentioned you studied under Chef Reyes, Jessica. There's a lot about Jessica's culinary background that might surprise you, Ryan said pointedly. The dinner proceeded with Antonio personally overseeing our service. He shared stories of my student days, describing technical challenges I'd overcome and innovative approaches I'd developed. Her final project was written up in the school's journal, the first student work they'd published in 5 years. With each anecdote, Walter's expression grew more impressed, while Margaret seemed to physically shrink in her seat. Her attempts to redirect conversation fell flat, as other guests became genuinely interested in the connection between Antonio and me. So, tell me about your bakery, one of Walter's colleagues asked me. If you trained under Antonio, it must be exceptional. I spoke passionately about Sweet Foundations, our signature items, and our community initiatives providing job training for at-risk youth. To my surprise, several guests recognized the name. My wife brings home your cinnamon. Brioche every Saturday, one man exclaimed. It's the highlight of our weekend. When the main course arrived, Antonio had prepared a special variation of his signature dish for me, incorporating a subtle reference to a technique we'd discussed years ago. The gesture brought unexpected tears to my eyes, not just for the thoughtfulness, but for the professional respect it represented. Throughout the meal, Margaret made several attempts to reassert control, but each effort fell noticeably flat. When she tried to monopolize Walter's attention, he gently but firmly turned back to continue his conversation with me. When she loudly praised the chef to remind everyone of her connection to securing this exclusive reservation, Antonio warmly credited me with inspiring aspects of his cooking philosophy. By the time dessert arrived, the power dynamics had shifted, visibly. Margaret sat stiffly, participating minimally, while the rest of the table engaged in lively conversation that frequently included me. Walter, in particular, seemed to be seeing both his wife and daughter-in-law with fresh eyes. The pinnacle moment came when Antonio presented the dessert course personally, an exquisite creation I immediately recognized as an elevated version of a recipe we had developed together during my training. For those who appreciate culinary history, Antonio announced to the table, this dessert has special significance. The foundation of this dish was created by Jessica during her final semester. We collaborated on the original concept, and I've been refining it ever since. It's now one of our signature offerings here at La Maison Dorée. As plates were served around the table, Walter raised his glass in my direction. To Jessica, whose talents clearly extend far beyond what we've given her credit for. Thank you for being part of our family. The toast was pointed in its implication, and Margaret's face flushed deeply. Ryan beamed at me, raising his own glass in support, followed by the rest of the table. As the evening drew to a close, several of Walter's colleagues and friends approached me individually. Some asked for my bakery's business card. Others simply wanted to compliment me on what they'd learned about my work. Each interaction happened within Margaret's line of sight, each one a small reinforcement that her attempt to diminish me had backfired spectacularly. Emma, who had watched the evening unfold with barely concealed delight, whispered to me during a quiet moment, "I've waited years to see someone stand up to her like this. You didn't just win a battle tonight, you changed the war." As we prepared to leave, Walter pulled me aside while Margaret collected her wrap. "I want to apologize for whatever happened with the invitation. I had no idea." His expression was troubled and sincere. "No matter what Margaret might think, you are always welcome at any family gathering." I squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Walter, and happy birthday." Ryan walked ahead with his father, leaving me momentarily alone with Margaret near the restaurant entrance. Her composed facade had returned, but something in her eyes had changed. "Well played," she said quietly, adjusting her shawl with hands that weren't quite steady. "I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, not even close, but it was the first time she had acknowledged me as an adversary worthy of respect rather than a temporary inconvenience to be managed. For tonight, that was enough. The drive home from the restaurant was charged with a mixture of emotions. Ryan kept glancing at me from the driver's seat, a combination of pride and residual anger playing across his features. "I still can't believe it," he said, shaking his head. "The look on Mom's face when Antonio started telling everyone about your culinary background, I think that image is permanently burned into my memory." I gazed out the window, watching the city lights blur past. The triumph of the evening was undeniable, but it came with complicated feelings. I didn't go there to humiliate her, you know. I just couldn't let her exclude me without standing up for myself. "You shouldn't have had to stand up for yourself at all," Ryan countered, his knuckles whitening slightly on the steering wheel. "I'm the one who should have put a stop to this, years ago. Every time I think about her uninviting you, my wife, from a family dinner and the things she said about you not fitting in, I feel sick." We pulled into our driveway, but neither of us moved to exit the car immediately. The quiet cocoon of the vehicle provided a space to process the evening's events before returning to reality. "I'm sorry," Ryan said finally, turning to face me. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening clearly enough. I'm sorry I made excuses for her behavior, and I'm sorry you had to be the one to finally stand up to her." The genuine remorse in his voice brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "You were conditioned your entire life to normalize her behavior. Breaking out of that pattern isn't easy. But it shouldn't have taken tonight's humiliation to wake me up completely." I reached over and took his hand. "What matters is that you see it now, and we face it together from here on out." Inside our home, we stayed up late into the night, dissecting the evening and discussing what it meant for our future relationship with his family. Ryan was adamant that things needed to change fundamentally. No more Sunday dinners where she treats you like an unwelcome guest, no more letting subtle insults slide, and absolutely no more situations where she tries to exclude you. "What about your father?" I asked softly. "You saw his face tonight. He had no idea what's been happening." Ryan ran his hands through his hair. "That's part of the problem. Dad has spent decades looking the other way when Mom's behavior crosses lines. He's not innocent in this. His passivity enabled her." As the night deepened, our conversation shifted from anger to strategy. This wasn't just about one dramatic confrontation. It was about reshaping our entire dynamic with Ryan's family moving forward. "We need boundaries," I said. "Clear, consistent boundaries about what we will and won't accept." Ryan nodded. "And consequences when those boundaries are crossed. No more second chances or benefit of the doubt." We fell asleep in the early morning hours, emotionally drained, but somehow lighter. Something fundamental had shifted, not just with Margaret, but between us. The burden I'd been carrying, trying to manage his mother's behavior while protecting Ryan from having to choose sides, had finally been acknowledged and shared. The next morning brought a flurry of calls and texts. Emma was first, her voice practically bubbling with excitement. "Jessica, you're my hero! The way you walked in with Antonio, I've never seen Mom speechless before. It was glorious." She wasn't alone. Ryan's cousins Michael and David both reached out with messages of support and, remarkably, similar stories of confrontations with Margaret over the years. "Welcome to the Stood Up to Margaret Club," Michael texted. "Membership is exclusive, but growing." Even more surprising were the messages from Walter's colleagues and friends who had been present at the dinner. 2 couples requested special orders from my bakery, and the wife of Walter's law partner asked if I would consider catering their anniversary party. But the most unexpected development came mid-morning, when the bell above my bakery door chimed, and I looked up to find Walter himself standing awkwardly among the display cases of pastries. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, looking around with genuine interest at the shop I'd built from nothing. "This is my first time here. It's very warm, inviting." I wiped my hands on my apron, flour dust momentarily clouding the air. "Walter, this is a surprise." He nodded, moving further into the space, examining the artfully arranged pastries with newfound appreciation. "I should have visited long ago. After last night, I realized how little I actually know about your work, despite all those dinners," where Margaret dominated the conversation. The directness of his comment, acknowledging his wife's controlling behavior, caught me off guard. Walter had always been pleasant but passive, observing family dynamics without intervening. "I came to apologize," he continued, meeting my eyes directly. "Not just for last night, but for 3 years of failing to properly welcome you into our family." I gestured toward a small table in the corner where customers sometimes enjoyed their pastries. "Would you like to sit? I can make us some coffee." Over freshly brewed coffee and still warm croissants, Walter shared a side of himself I'd never been allowed to see. "Margaret wasn't always like this," he said, staring into his cup. "Or perhaps she was, and I just didn't notice because her controlling nature served me well professionally." "What do you mean?" He sighed heavily. "Margaret comes from a background not unlike yours, actually. Her father was a factory foreman, her mother a school secretary. But she was determined to rise socially, to create the perfect family image." This revelation stunned me. Margaret had always presented herself as coming from old money, with references to family properties and long-standing social connections. "She reinvented herself completely before I met her," Walter continued. "Changed her accent, studied etiquette books, cultivated friendships with people who could advance our social standing. For years, I admired her ambition. It complemented my career perfectly to have a wife who could navigate social circles with such apparent ease." "She never mentioned any of this," I said quietly. "She wouldn't. Margaret buried her past so thoroughly that she panics whenever someone threatens to expose the carefully constructed identity she's built." He looked at me with new understanding. "That's why she felt so threatened by you from the beginning. You represent everything she worked to escape. Authenticity, building something with your own hands, being proud of your background rather than hiding it." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Margaret's obsessive need for control, her fixation on social status, her extreme reaction to anyone who didn't fit her carefully curated world, it wasn't just snobbery, it was fear. Fear that her carefully constructed facade might crumble, if examined too closely. "I'm not excusing her behavior," Walter added quickly. "What she did to you, what I allowed her to do through my silence, was wrong. I've spent decades enabling her worst impulses because it was easier than confronting them. Why are you telling me this now?" He twisted his coffee cup slowly. Last night was a wake-up call. Seeing you walk in with Antonio, hearing about your accomplishments that Margaret had deliberately minimized. I realized how complicit I've been in allowing her to mistreat people who don't conform to her vision, especially you. As our conversation continued, Walter asked thoughtful questions about my business, my culinary background, my dreams for the future. For the first time, I felt truly seen by my father-in-law, not as an interloper who had captured his son, but as a person of value in my own right. Before leaving, he hesitated by the door. I've asked Margaret to consider counseling, both. Couples counseling for us and individual therapy for her. I don't know if she'll agree, but I made it clear that things cannot continue as they have been. That's significant, I said carefully. It should have happened years ago. His expression was resolute. I've also made it clear that if she can't find a way to treat you with respect, she risks damaging her relationship with Ryan permanently. And with me. After Walter left, I called Ryan to share the details of our conversation. He was as surprised as I had been by his father's visit and revelations about Margaret's background. Dad's never stood up to Mom like this before, he said, sounding both impressed and cautiously optimistic. Maybe last night affected them both more deeply than we realized. The ripple effects of the restaurant confrontation continued throughout the week. My bakery saw a sudden increase in new customers. Apparently, word had spread through Margaret's social circle about the fascinating connection between the baker daughter-in-law and the celebrated chef at La Maison Dorée. The irony wasn't lost on me. Margaret's attempt to exclude me had inadvertently elevated my professional standing among the very people she had tried to impress. Even more surprising was the call I received from Antonio midweek, proposing a special collaboration event between his restaurant and my bakery. Nothing flashy, he assured me over the phone. Just an evening highlighting local culinary talent. Your desserts paired with our tasting menu. What do you think? The opportunity was too good to pass up, both professionally and personally. I'd be honored, Antonio. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he laughed. I'll work you harder than I did in culinary school. But Jessica, it's about time your talents received wider recognition. As the dust settled from the dramatic evening, I found myself reflecting on how standing up for myself had unexpectedly created professional opportunities I might never have accessed otherwise. My business was thriving, my creative passion rekindled by the validation from a respected mentor. But more importantly, the dynamics with Ryan's family had fundamentally shifted. Ryan had established firm boundaries with his mother, making it clear that any future relationship depended on her treatment of me. Walter had emerged from his passive role to become an unexpected ally. And Margaret was being uncharacteristically quiet. The true test would come soon enough. Ryan and I had agreed to host the next family gathering at our home, on our terms, in our territory. Whether Margaret would accept the new normal remained to be seen. Each night I still wrote in my journal, but the entries had changed. Instead of documenting slights and insults, I recorded small victories, moments of growth, and plans for the future. A future where I no longer sought Margaret's approval, but stood confidently in my own worth. 3 weeks after the restaurant confrontation, I was elbow-deep in bread dough when Lisa, my assistant, poked her head into the kitchen with a strange expression. Jessica, your mother-in-law is here." The dough suddenly felt heavier in my hands. "Margaret? Here? At the bakery?" Lisa nodded, wide-eyed. "She's sitting at the corner table. Said she'll wait until you're available." In the 3 years since marrying Ryan, Margaret had never once visited my bakery. The idea of her sitting among my regular customers, surrounded by the business I'd built from nothing, was so incongruous it took me a moment to process. "Tell her I'll be out in 10 minutes, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the anxiety suddenly churning in my stomach. I finished shaping the loaves with mechanical precision, my mind racing. What could Margaret possibly want? Ryan, and I hadn't heard from her directly since the restaurant incident, communicating only through Walter or Emma about family matters. After washing up and removing my apron, I took a steadying breath and stepped into the front of the bakery. Margaret sat primly at the corner table, looking simultaneously regal and uncomfortable in her designer outfit, amidst the homey, rustic atmosphere of my shop. "Margaret," I said, approaching her table, "this is a surprise." She glanced up, her expression carefully composed, though her fingers fidgeted with her purse strap. "Jessica, thank you for seeing me." The formality in her tone was familiar, but something was different. The usual undercurrent of judgment was muted, replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. "Would you like some coffee or tea?" I offered, falling back on basic hospitality to navigate this unexpected situation. "Tea would be nice, thank you." I signaled to Lisa, who brought over 2 cups of Earl Grey and a plate of freshly baked madeleines, the French butter cookies that were today's special. An awkward silence settled between us as Margaret delicately added a splash of milk to her tea. I waited, determined not to fill the void with nervous chatter. She had come to my territory. She could state her purpose. "Your shop is charming," she finally said, glancing around. "Very popular, it seems." "We do well," I replied evenly. "What brings you here today, Margaret?" Her carefully applied makeup couldn't quite conceal the shadows under her eyes or the new tension lines around her mouth. Whatever had prompted this visit, it hadn't come easily to her. "I wanted to speak with you directly," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "About what happened at Walter's birthday dinner." I nodded but remained silent, waiting. "Your connection to Chef Reyes was unexpected." Her fingers tightened around her teacup. "As was the revelation about your professional background." It wasn't quite an admission of wrongdoing, but from Margaret, even this oblique reference to her misjudgment was significant. "There were many things about me you chose not to learn, Margaret." A flash of the old defensiveness crossed her face. "You never mentioned studying under a renowned chef." "You never asked," I countered calmly. "Anytime I spoke about my work or background, you changed the subject or dismissed it as unimportant." She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, something shifting in her expression. "Walter says I've been unfair to you." "Have you been?" The directness of my question seemed to catch her off guard. In the past, I would have softened the confrontation, made it easier for her to deflect responsibility. Not anymore. Margaret stared at her tea for a long moment. When she looked up, her composure cracked, revealing something raw and unexpected. "Walter has insisted we attend counseling. He says if I don't make genuine efforts to change, he's considering separation, after 40 years of marriage." The revelation stunned me. Gentle, conflict-averse Walter had issued an ultimatum? "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "Are you?" There was a bite in her question, a glimpse of the old Margaret. "Yes, actually. Despite everything, I've never wanted your marriage to suffer. I've only wanted to be treated with basic respect." Margaret picked up a madeleine but didn't eat it, turning the delicate shell-shaped cookie in her fingers. "Walter told me about your conversation, about what he shared regarding my background." I nodded, uncertain where this was heading. "It's true," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father worked at the paper mill. We lived in a 2-bedroom house with linoleum floors and secondhand furniture. My clothes were either homemade or from discount stores," she set the cookie down untouched, her hands trembling slightly. "I worked so hard to leave that life behind, to create something different for my children, to build connections with the right people, to learn the right behaviors. There's nothing shameful about coming from humble beginnings," I said gently. "Isn't there?" Her laugh was brittle. "In the circles I've spent decades cultivating, background is everything. Who your family is, Where you summer, which schools you attended. I fabricated most of my history to fit in. I've lived in terror of being exposed as an imposter. The admission explained so much about her behavior. The rigid adherence to social rules, the obsession with appearances, the panic whenever anyone threatened the carefully constructed world she'd built. When Ryan brought you home, she continued, all I could see was everything I'd spent my life escaping. Someone authentic, unpolished, proud of their background instead of hiding it. It felt like you were holding up a mirror to the person I'd worked so hard to bury. I never intended to threaten you, Margaret. I know that. Now. She took a sip of tea, visibly gathering herself. The therapist, Walter, insisted I see, says I've developed patterns of controlling behavior to manage my own anxiety about social rejection. The clinical assessment sounded rehearsed, but the fact that she was repeating it at all suggested she'd actually attended the therapy sessions. What do you want from me, Margaret? I asked directly. She seemed startled by the question. I'm not entirely sure. Walter says I need to make amends. The therapist says I need to practice authentic interactions instead of manipulative ones. She straightened her already perfect posture. I suppose I came to say that I recognize my behavior toward you has been problematic. It wasn't exactly an apology, but from a woman who had likely never admitted fault in her adult life. It represented a monumental step. Thank you for acknowledging that, I said, deciding to meet her halfway. It means a lot to hear you say it. Margaret looked down at the untouched plate of madeleines. These look quite professional. Would you like to see how they're made? The words surprised us both. Margaret's head snapped up, confusion evident in her expression. What? The madeleines. Would you like to see the kitchen? How we make them? After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, something like curiosity flickering across her features. Yes, I think I would. Leading Margaret through the swinging doors into my professional kitchen felt surreal. Worlds colliding in ways I never imagined. I showed her the commercial mixers, the proofing cabinets, the specialized ovens. To my surprise, she asked thoughtful questions, paying attention to the answers. My mother never taught me to cook, she admitted suddenly as she watched Lisa pipe cream into eclairs. She was always too tired from working. And later, when I married Walter, it seemed important to have staff handle those things. The vulnerability in her statement was so unexpected that I found myself responding in kind. My grandmother taught me. Sunday afternoons were for baking, no matter what else was happening in our lives. For a moment, we shared a genuine connection, two women with different experiences finding an unexpected point of understanding. Before leaving, Margaret paused awkwardly by the door. Perhaps you might consider teaching me to make something simple sometime, as a starting point. The request was so far removed from our previous interactions that I momentarily wondered if I'd misheard. You want baking lessons? A flash of the old Margaret, defensive, proud, surfaced, briefly before she visibly reined it in. The therapist suggested finding authentic ways to connect with family members. This seemed potentially suitable. It wasn't warm or natural, but it was honest. Perhaps the most honest Margaret had ever been with me. We could try that, I agreed cautiously. Maybe start with something basic like cookies or quick bread. She nodded stiffly. I'll check my calendar and be in touch. After she left, I stood in my bakery feeling like I'd experienced some strange alternate reality. Margaret seeking me out, acknowledging her behavior, asking to learn from me. It was a fundamental shift I hadn't seen coming. When I told Ryan about the visit that evening, he was equally stunned. Mom asked for baking lessons? From you? Voluntarily? It was as awkward as it sounds, I confirmed, but it seemed genuine, or at least as genuine as Margaret is capable of being right now. Dad mentioned the therapy ultimatum, Ryan said, shaking his head in wonder. I never thought he had it. in him to stand up to her like that. Over the following weeks, a new family dynamic slowly emerged. We hosted that first dinner at our home as planned, a simple but elegant meal that showcased my culinary skills without being intimidating. Margaret arrived with a store-bought bottle of wine and visible anxiety. Throughout the evening, I could see her catching herself before making critical comments, physically biting her tongue at times. The effort, while obvious, was meaningful. Walter seemed more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, engaging me in conversation about my business, plans, and actually listening to the answers. Ryan stayed close to my side, ready to intervene if necessary, but the evening passed without major incident. "She's trying," Emma observed quietly as we cleared dishes together. "It's awkward and painful to watch, but I've never seen her make this kind of effort before." The true test came when the first baking lesson actually materialized. Margaret arrived at my bakery after hours, dressed inappropriately formally for kitchen work, but with determined resolve in her eyes. "I thought we'd start with something simple but rewarding," I explained, laying out ingredients for basic shortbread cookies. "These are hard to mess up, but still impressive when done right." Margaret nodded, awkwardly donning the apron I offered. "I should warn you that I've never done anything like this before." "Everyone starts somewhere," I replied, guiding her through measuring ingredients. Her first attempts were predictably disastrous. Flour everywhere, cookies rolled too uneven, thicknesses, edges burnt while centers remained undercooked. In the past, such failure would have triggered Margaret's worst defensiveness. Instead, I watched her take a deep breath and try again with surprising determination. "You have to understand," she explained as she re-rolled dough for her third attempt. "In my world, you either excelled at something immediately or you didn't do it at all. Showing imperfection was unacceptable." "That sounds exhausting," I commented, adjusting the oven temperature. "It is." She pressed cookie cutters with careful precision. "I've spent my entire adult life performing perfection." By the end of the evening, Margaret had produced exactly 6 presentable cookies out of several dozen attempts. Instead of focusing on the failures, she photographed her successes with childlike pride. "Next time," she said as she carefully packed her edible creations into a container, "perhaps you could show me those lemon tarts Ryan always raves about." "Next time," I agreed, surprised to find I wasn't dreading the prospect. Outside the bakery, professional changes were unfolding as well. The collaboration with Antonio became a reality, a special event featuring a 5-course meal at La Maison Dorée with desserts from Sweet Foundations. The event sold out within hours of being announced. To my absolute shock, Margaret not only attended but brought 4 couples from her social circle, introducing me to them as my talented daughter-in-law, the pastry chef partnering with Antonio Reyes. Watching her navigate the evening was fascinating. Her social skills were undeniably impressive when not being weaponized against me. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, subtly directing influential people toward my dessert display, nodding approvingly as they complimented my work. "You're actually quite good at this networking thing when you're not using it against me," I commented during a quiet moment. Margaret's smile held a hint of her old sharpness, but with a new self-awareness. "I've had decades of practice making. People pay attention to the things I value. It seems I might as well use that skill constructively for once." The event's success led to increased visibility for my bakery and, remarkably, a more genuine relationship with Margaret. Not warm or close, that would have been too much to expect, but based on something approaching mutual respect. Our relationship reset came with clear boundaries. Ryan and I made major life decisions without seeking Margaret's input or approval. We declined invitations that didn't respect both of us equally. We called out controlling behavior directly when it emerged, which still happened with frustrating regularity. But small changes accumulated into significant transformation. Margaret asking about my business with genuine interest. Walter stopping by the bakery to share business articles he thought might help me expand. Ryan standing firmly with me when old patterns resurfaced, no longer torn between wife and mother. Inspired by my experience with Antonio, I began mentoring young bakers from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing the same kind of support that had been so crucial to my own development. The first time Margaret actually asked thoughtful questions about one of my mentees, her background, her talents, her goals, I nearly dropped the teacup I was holding. "What?" Margaret asked, noticing my surprise. "Nothing," I replied, recovering quickly. "It's just nice to see you taking an interest." She smoothed her napkin with practiced precision. "I'm trying to see people for who they are, not who I think they should be. It's not easy to change habits of a lifetime." "No," I agreed, "but it matters that you're trying." 1 year after the restaurant confrontation that changed everything, my bakery expanded to a second location in the upscale district where many of Margaret's friends shopped and dined. The grand opening attracted local press, loyal customers, from our original location and, still somewhat surprising to me, Ryan's entire family, including Margaret. "The display case arrangement is quite effective," she commented, studying the artfully arranged pastries with a professional eye she'd developed over months of our sporadic baking lessons. "Very appealing visual flow." Coming from Margaret, this was high praise indeed. Our relationship had evolved into something neither of us could have imagined a year earlier. Not close friendship, certainly, but a careful respect built on new understanding. The journey hadn't been smooth or simple. Margaret still struggled with her controlling tendencies, still occasionally slipped into passive-aggressive comments when stressed or feeling threatened. But now, these incidents were exceptions rather than the rule, and they were addressed directly rather than festering beneath the surface. Ryan noticed the change more than anyone. "You know what struck me yesterday?" he said as we prepared for bed one night. "Mom called you by your name 3 separate times during dinner, not Ryan's wife or the baker or any of those distancing terms she used to use, just Jessica." Such small victories marked our progress, Margaret asking my opinion on a dinner menu, Walter defending my business decisions when a friend made dismissive comments, family gatherings where conversation flowed naturally without carefully navigated minefields. The most significant moment came when Ryan and I announced we were expecting our first child. Margaret's reaction surprised us both. Instead of immediately launching into opinions about names, nursery decor, or child-rearing philosophies, she simply hugged us both and said, "What wonderful news. How are you feeling, Jessica?" Later, she did slip into her old pattern of sending unsolicited baby-related articles and making pronouncements about proper childcare approaches. But when Ryan gently pointed this out, she actually stopped, apologized, and asked instead what kind of support would be most helpful. "I don't know how to be helpful without taking control," she admitted during one of our now regular coffee meetings. "It's the only way I know how to show I care." "You could ask what we need instead of assuming you know," I suggested. "Being supportive doesn't mean making decisions for us." She nodded thoughtfully, adding another small but meaningful adjustment to her behavior pattern. My relationship with Walter deepened in unexpected ways as well. His passion for historical architecture complemented my interest in traditional baking techniques, leading to fascinating conversations about how both our fields honored craftsmanship and tradition. He began bringing me antique cookbooks from Dios estate sales, genuinely delighted when I incorporated historical recipes into my seasonal menus. "I missed out on years of knowing you," he told me one afternoon as we examined a worn Victorian-era baking manual he'd found. "I let Margaret's attitudes shape my perceptions instead of forming my own. That was my failure." The approaching birth of our child seemed to accelerate the healing process for the entire family. Margaret channeled her organizational energy into helping with practical preparations, researching pediatricians, arranging a cleaning service for after the birth, but always checking first if her assistance was wanted. Our family dinners rotated between homes now, including regular meals at our house where I could showcase my culinary skills without apology or diminishment. Margaret even began bringing her baking attempts for dessert, still amateur but made with surprising dedication. "I never realized how much work goes into creating something from raw ingredients," she admitted after presenting a lopsided but tasty apple tart. "All those years of dismissing your work, I simply didn't understand the skill involved." One evening, as we gathered around our dining table, Ryan, Walter, Margaret, Emma, and her husband, plus a few close friends, I looked around and realized how profoundly things had changed. The tension that had once suffused every family gathering had been replaced by something approaching genuine warmth. Not perfect, still occasionally awkward, but real. Antonio, who had become a regular part of our extended circle, raised his glass in a toast. To Jessica, whose talent in the kitchen is matched only by her courage in life. And to family, those we're born to and those we choose. Margaret caught my eye across the table and nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement of our journey from antagonist to something like family. Later that night, as Ryan and I cleared dishes together, he wrapped his arms around me from behind, his hands resting gently on my growing belly. "You know what I realized tonight? We've actually created something beautiful from all that mess. Not just professional success for you, but a healthier family for our child to be born into." I leaned back against him, considering his words. It took standing in my truth to make it happen. That night at the restaurant, when I refused to be excluded, it forced everyone to face reality instead of the comfortable illusions they'd constructed. "You changed everything by refusing to be invisible," he agreed. Mom needed that wake-up call, painful as it was. In quiet moments alone, I still sometimes marveled at the transformation. From the outsider, desperately seeking approval, to a woman confidently standing in her own worth. From a family fractured by control and resentment, to one slowly learning healthier patterns. The healing wasn't perfect or complete. Margaret still struggled with old habits, especially under stress. Family gatherings occasionally hit rough patches when sensitive topics arose. The decades of established patterns couldn't be erased completely, only gradually reformed with conscious effort from everyone involved. But the fundamental shift was undeniable. I no longer measured my worth through Margaret's approval. Ryan no longer felt torn between loyalty to his wife and duty to his mother. Walter had found his voice after decades of silence, and Margaret herself was slowly discovering that authentic connections, though messier and more vulnerable, brought deeper satisfaction than perfect appearances. A few weeks before my due date, Margaret asked if I would teach her to make my signature, chocolate chip cookies, the recipe that had first put my bakery on the local map. "I thought it might be nice," she explained somewhat stiffly, "to be able to make them for my grandchild someday. A connection between generations." As we stood side by side in my kitchen, Margaret carefully following my instructions with uncharacteristic humility, I reflected on how far we'd come. The woman who had once seen me as a threat to her carefully constructed world was now learning from me, creating something with her own hands rather than simply ordering or judging the results. "You know," I said, as she precisely measured vanilla extract, "the most important ingredient in any recipe isn't listed in the instructions." "What's that?" she asked, looking up with genuine curiosity. "Forgiveness," I replied simply. "For yourself, when things don't turn out perfectly. That's what makes the difference between baking as a joyful act and baking as just another performance." Margaret's hands stilled for a moment as she absorbed my words. "I'm still learning that part," she admitted quietly, "in the kitchen and beyond." "We all are," I assured her, "one batch of cookies at a time." Sometimes the most uncomfortable confrontations lead to the most necessary growth. Standing up for yourself doesn't always mean winning every battle. Sometimes it means changing the entire war, transforming enemies into allies, or at least into people who can share the same table with mutual respect. My mother-in-law and I will never be best friends. Our backgrounds, values, and approaches to life remain fundamentally different. But we've found a way to exist in the same family ecosystem without poisoning the roots. And in doing so, we've created space for something new to grow, something healthier for the next generation. As I look back on that night at La Maison Dorée when I refused to remain invisible, I realize the true victory wasn't in Margaret's public embarrassment or even in the professional opportunities that followed. It was in reclaiming my own worth, in standing firmly in my truth until others had no choice but to see me clearly. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to make you feel small or unworthy? How did you handle it, and what changed afterward? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. And if this journey of standing up for myself against my controlling mother-in-law resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that they deserve a seat at the table too. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the most delicious revenge is simply refusing to disappear.